Thanks so much for being with us today. We're talking with members of the Portlanders for Parks campaign in support of a levy for Portland parks. And I'm wondering if one of you wants to start off by telling us a little bit about what the measure would do and why people should vote for it.
Well, how about we introduce ourselves first so everybody
Sure.
knows who the players are. Kia, do you want to go first?
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Kia Selly. I'm a licensed landscape architect, and for a little over 4 years, I was the Assets and Development Division Manager at Portland Parks and Recreation. And most recently, I was the interim director for almost a year. I am now a development consultant with my own firm, Selly Partnerships. And thank you for the opportunity to be here.
I can go next and really quick. Amy Ruiz with Strategies 360, working on the campaign side, largely here to make sure we can capture any needed follow-ups.
My name is Andre Middleton. I'm the Executive Director of Friends of Noise. Also, I'm a member of the BAC, the Budget Advisory Committee for Portland Parks and Rec. And I'm just representing myself and representing my perspective to this budget levy.
Yeah, it's not the budget advisory board, Andre. My name is Randy Gregg. I'm the executive director of the Portland Parks Foundation, and I will explain a little bit about our outlook on this levy. I think most of us would agree the park system is the heart and soul of Portland, all 11,000 acres and 470 facilities of it. It includes community centers, 10 swimming pools, world-class gardens, art classes, daycare, and of course actual parks, tennis, futsal, basketball, baseball, and soccer fields. 253 athletic groups, leagues, and teams logged in about 193,000 hours of time in our parks facilities last year. And in a normal summer, PPR, Portland Parks and Recreation, puts on free movies and concerts and other cultural events for families in parks. From jazz concerts in Washington Park to the first Tongan dance festival in the country to Finding Nemo, dubbed in Navajo, presented in Cully Park. And then a little known fact is PPR also provides free lunches to kids who are enrolled in school lunch programs, but in the summer would otherwise potentially go hungry. A normal summer, PPR provides about 90,000 lunches. And this summer, with the help of federal money, they have provided 500,000 lunches. PPR's parks rangers are often the frontline contact with those living outside. And then of course there's nature. Our system includes about 8,000 acres of natural areas and watersheds and 1.2 million trees. Portlanders, we love our parks and our recreation system, and now that system really needs our help. We've got two big problems with the system. One has been a decade in the making, and then there's one that has been brought to us by COVID-19. I'll start with the longer term problem. There's a structural deficit caused by Portland Parks and Recreation's reliance on fees. About 27 cents of every dollar of the budget is collected through rec fees and permits for events. The maintenance needs for a 100-year-old system and the growing cost of providing equitable wages and health care to employees, all that's growing much faster than the general fund and these fees can bear. I think you'll remember a reckoning of sorts came last year that necessitated about a 7% cut, $6.7 million. But this longer slide has been going on for a decade. For instance, maintenance staff has been cut by 11% over the last 10 years. And that's while the city has grown 13%. And so, for example, of those 400 plus facilities, the Bureau has 3 electricians. Maintaining all of those trees are 12 arborists, meaning that there's 1 arborist for every 100,000 trees in the park system. Nick Fish Nick Fish formed a task force to study this problem and to try to figure out a more sustainable funding path. And I sat on that. And we projected out 15 years and discovered that costs would likely increase by about 16%, while historic revenues, if revenues stayed at historic levels, they would only grow by 5%. And so with no change in this picture, we would see a gradual closure of facilities. 1 in 4 was projected over that 15 years. And to maintain, just maintain existing facilities and programs, that's not even adding, we would need about 50% more funding. So we looked at a bunch of different revenue streams: a food and beverage tax, a lodging tax, a cell phone tax. At a November work session with the city council, the mayor suggested adding a high income tax. And of course, Nick was very slow and methodical and wanted to make sure everybody was on board, and weighing next steps. But then, he passed away, and then COVID hit, and the community centers and the programs closed. And suddenly none of that 27 cents per dollar was being collected. And so, presto, the slow slide became a kind of a plunge off a cliff to the tune of about $16 million. So without backfilling that, our Parks and Rec system will look extremely different: even less maintenance and substantially fewer rec programs right when we need them most, whether you're a kid hoping to learn to swim, a senior in need of exercise and friends, a mom who needs some time away from her kids to get some work done. It'll mean 1,700 fewer jobs. PPR, by the way, is the largest summer employer of youth. And so this is a real crisis. This is a real problem. And so the mayor and PPR decided action was needed and put forth this levy. And I'm going to say personally, when they first started talking about it, I thought it was nuts. I mean, there's a lot of money ballots on the measure, and it's like, why not wait till May? But if we did that, there wouldn't be any money in time to hire for next summer. So even as we adapt to COVID or get a vaccine, our parks programs would be shuttered. So this levy would backfill that crisis. It'll reopen rec centers and programs. It'll reverse this long-standing maintenance decline in parks and natural spaces. And it'll assure Multnomah Arts Center and IFCC and other community centers won't close. And it'll provide operational funding for Columbia Pool, or eventually for whatever pool replaces it. And then it goes one step farther. It creates more equitable access to recreation programs for all Portlanders through free and sliding scale programs for folks who are facing financial challenges. It'll cost 80 cents per thousand of assessed value. That's about $13 for the average a month for the average Portland homeowner, and it'll generate $48 million a year for 5 years. We have, I think, one of the widest sets of endorsements of any money measure on the ballot, from frontline groups like Verde and Apano to environmental groups like Audubon and OLCV, to little groups like Brown Folks Fishing, to the Portland Business Alliance and the home builders. This is not a wealth tax. Many hands make lighter work. It's spread across evenly, all taxpayers. It's also not really buying anything new, like some of the ballot measures. It's preserving the system that we have and the one that we cherish, and too often the one we take for granted. And we're gonna make it a lot more accessible to a lot more people. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kia.
I'm sorry, is there a question or?
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so this was open to questions.
Yeah, open to questions. Sorry for the
Okay.
format here.
Thank you. Thank you for giving that overview. I appreciate it. I'm wondering if you can go into the detail of how those revenues are going to be used. Like, is there a certain percentage that will go to deferred maintenance? Is there a certain percentage that's going to go to ensure that that fees are, that entrance to certain community centers are free or something like that? Has that been kind of figured out in terms of how that money would be dispersed?
excuse me, in rough buckets, about 2/3 of it is going to go towards backfilling the maintenance needs, and about 1/3 of it towards programmatic needs. In terms of line items, that's a little less specific at this point in time. I'm not sure if Todd can speak to some of those line items more specifically.
Sure, I'll just add within the 2/3 of the maintenance bucket, those are things like the electricians that Randy mentioned in his presentation about routine maintenance in parks, where we go daily, weekly, monthly to do preventative maintenance within structures that we have across the system. And then also on the tree maintenance side, as Randy mentioned, we have 12 arborists today for the 1.2 million trees that Portland Parks and Recreation has on its properties across the city. And so we'll be increasing the preventative maintenance we provide in those trees. We just do emergency maintenance today. So for instance, in this past windstorm, we had over 400 work orders of down trees, hazardous limbs, both in parks and on right of way. And so those 12 people worked around the clock, and they're still working. They worked through, the past couple weeks. And so that will be another area of enhancing services. And then, as Randy mentioned, the 1/3 will be reducing the cost burden of the recreation program of raising those fees. And so the opportunity presents itself to both provide a robust scholarship program, as well as you see now Portland Parks and Recreation is piloting a sliding scale on its virtual programming, where we're doing virtual preschool programming with a sliding scale pricing structure, something that we haven't been able to do in the past because we covered the expenses for the recreation program. Over 40% of the expenses were paid by those fees collected from swim lessons or preschool or after school programs.
So can you talk a little bit about fees, just in terms of how people will see that change? Because I'm not sure if I completely understand, if this levy passes, what are the, how will people interact with our community centers differently? I mean, in terms of paying for entrance or whatever.
Well, I think very simply, basically, and Kia could speak to this more specifically, the community centers are kind of run like small businesses, or have been, traditionally. And so they've had to, really, think hard about, how to charge the most fees in order to, do programs. And this will allow the first question to be is, who do we want to have access to those programs? And how many want access to those programs? And then base the fee structure more on that, so that there's a sliding scale that will allow people to basically pay what they can afford.
And do you expect that those fees will go up for people in terms of their income level? If they're able to afford it, then they will see increases in fees. People at a certain other income level may have a reduced fee or free entrance or free.
Yeah, lower income people will have there will be more free programs, and then lower income folks will be able to pay less on a sliding scale. In terms of upper income folks who are using the facilities, there's sort of a point of where it's like cheaper to go to 24-hour fitness or something like that. So so I think there's there's a limit to how high you can go and how you want to go. So it will. Again, center equity is the first question in the equation.
That has always actually been the tension with setting fees is, of course, there is a revenue generating need for these programs, but you can only set the fees so high where they become higher than the market, the private market. And Randy's example of 24-hour fitness is a really good one. Just a data snapshot, Southwest Community Center, the active pass, which is for an adult, is $47 a month. And a membership for 1 month at 24-hour fitness is almost $47 a month. So you can see that really Southwest Community Center is at the upper end of what they can charge before members might go elsewhere. And then of course, if you price services too high, then community members and individuals that really need that access won't be able to afford it. So there's always been a tension with setting fees.
Is the vision that with fees, just whether they change or not, and this levy, that Portland Parks could be self-sustaining? I guess self-sustaining wouldn't be the right word because you're getting property taxes, but the idea, would you need additional or less general fund money going forward?
The idea is not to get less general fund. The idea is to basically, as Randy described, backfill. This would be backfilling to the status quo with the added benefit of having this sliding scale for access to programs. So this is really the mid-range to what's envisioned. We know that the community really wants and needs more in the future. And so over the next 5 years, we have the time as a community to come together and talk about how we might do that better. But City Council will likely over time need to allocate some resources for new parks through operations and maintenance. So there actually might need to be some additional resources brought to the new parks for operations and maintenance on the capital side.
Okay. And so this is perceived as just being, I guess at this point, a 5-year levy with perhaps a different revenue structure put in place for the future?
That's the goal, is that this actually helps address some of the issues that Portland Parks is facing now with the budget, compounded by COVID, with this the inability to generate additional revenue with COVID closures. And again, it gives us time, it gives us less than 5 years, but effectively 5 years to really think through a new structure for how Portland Parks and Recreation might operate more sustainably, as well as provide those added services that we know that the community really wants and needs.
Will this levy be enough to resolve maintenance that's been deferred for however many years? Like over the course of this levy, will you be able to pay down completely the maintenance that hasn't been done? I'm not sure what your backlog is at this point.
Go ahead, Andre.
I was going to say, reality, no. And the important thing to think about this levy is that it's not looking to make all the repairs needed, but it's really going to save money in having a reduction of future repairs. If you look at a place like Columbia Pool, the deferred maintenance is actually multiplied over the amount of time that maintenance isn't conducted. By hopefully making current repairs, we end up reducing the need for future repairs. So it's, in that case, it's actually going to save money over the long term.
Yeah, let me add. So Helen, when we did the study last year, we looked at sort of 3 different scenarios. One was, what would happen if we didn't do anything differently, which, as I mentioned, was, ultimately closure of more facilities. And what would it take to maintain the existing, system? And that was roughly about a 50% increase in funding. And this is closer to that. It's really what it's doing is maintaining, the existing system. Now, the sliding, details of this are still to be worked out. But the sliding scale, if the levy funds rec programs at a baseline, sliding scale revenues can go toward additional capital maintenance. But there's a $400 million backlog of capital maintenance, and that's going to take a long time to chip away at. And that's the other thing in terms of stepping back and really trying to look at the long-term sustainability of the system. A levy was certainly on our initial menu, so was a bond. The levy is sort of the least regressive of those options, and then but hopefully restaurants will come back, and maybe we look at a food and beverage tax of some kind. Maybe we look at some other revenues, but it's going to take a little bit of time to sort of recover and understand exactly what taxation is going to look like going forward, and what revenues are going to be needed.
Okay.
And it's also fair to say that sliding scale funding means is often not revenue neutral. I mean, those who can afford to pay more, especially for Portland Parks and Rec, often I don't doubt would pay more. And this levy is really an investment to make sure that the current resources that will be available to all are still there come next summer. I mean, it would be a real double hit if the trees weren't taken care of, if the facilities weren't able to be inhabited. I mean, if they're not inhabited, then they're just being mothballed, and the cost of getting them back online in some point in the future will be more of what we're asking for now.
So, I mean,
I
go ahead.
I really appreciate your comment as a former Assets and Development Division Manager. I appreciate your comment about the deferred maintenance backlog, because it's something that we spent a lot of time getting additional resources from City Council to do more major capital project repairs. But the key words here are really preventative maintenance. And with sufficient staff doing maintenance, doing preventative maintenance, you can actually delay a lot of the maintenance issues in the major rebuilding that Parks is experiencing now. So that 11% decline over the past 10 years is really notable, and having more maintenance people on deck and having more preventative maintenance occurring is key for those assets, because you can delay some of the major capital repairs if proper preventative maintenance is in order.
And I guess this gets at just one of the concerns we have. Is this enough in terms of, like, if our 5 years, are we going to see 5 years down the road that preventative maintenance wasn't enough, and that these resources that millions have been put into and invested in have just been allowed to fall into such a state of disrepair that the only solution is replacement?
So there'll always be a need to do some replacement. Assets can't just continue, in perpetuity. They do have a limited life, but with proper preventative maintenance, you can delay major capital investments. But to your point, if there are more maintenance people that are brought to projects and they're doing that preventative maintenance, asset management industry professionals will tell you without any hesitation that will delay major capital investments. So for example, caring for a roof. If you clean gutters and you remove debris from a roof, it will then last its full useful life. But if none of that maintenance is done over the lifetime of a roof, it will last maybe half the time. And Parks has seen some of those examples of the lack of preventative maintenance has led to earlier capital investments.
And while I'm not an arborist, in attending some of the BAC meetings, I learned just how much of that maintenance is to the canopy and to the trees. And those are, dare I say, assets that are growing and changing every day. And, there are a lot of parks that could, without that kind of daily maintenance, become uninhabitable, where even if it's just to play ball or to have fun, those spaces can become unsafe if that routine maintenance isn't applied to those resources.
And I appreciate the history that you gave, Randy, about how we got to this place, but there's a certain amount of frustration that there wasn't action sooner. That certainly this the city budget office has raised this year after year about the structural deficit in the Portland Parks budget. And so I guess, what would you say to voters who are just so frustrated with the lack of leadership that has to address this in a timely manner, so that we're having this crisis kind of funding? situation? How would you tell them, or what would you tell them to say that, you know, this is the right move?
Well, nobody could have predicted COVID, and so that has put a much sharper point on it. But I understand what you're saying. You know, I mean, I think there has been frustration, and I think that Commissioner Fish was attempting to address that. You know, a mission-driven bureau like Parks is visible and trying to serve the public. It's a really different thing when you're meeting people at rec centers and in parks and things. And I think that there was just a tremendous effort to stretch a dollar every possible way over the years. I mean, I've sat on the budget advisory committee for, I think it's about 6 years now. And it's always just trying to figure out how to make it work. And the city council has actually been, over that time, pretty generous to parks as much as it could be in terms of making up little bits of pieces of money. But the necessity of a sustainable funding model has been a discussion for a long time, as you say. And I think we were finally kind of turning the corner to having that discussion with a really gifted politician who could have led that, but unfortunately that got cut short. And so this is, on a certain level, an emergency measure. It was done quickly, but at the same time, it is effectively trying to hit that 50% increase in funding that has been needed all along. There's going to be very tight, oversight of this. There's going to be a budget oversight committee that will, examine it. There's going to be additional community process in terms of allocations. So, some of it's a little bit reverse engineering, but I also think that it's going forward in the most methodical way that we possibly can at this very, very, troubling moment in which parks have become absolutely essential in ways that we would have never even imagined a year ago.
I appreciate your concerns, Helen, because I was in those conversations for several years as a staff person, and later you might recall that it was under my leadership that we found this over $6 million structural operating gap, and really called attention to that, and said now is the time to address it with some very difficult decisions. And City Council was supportive then to the extent that they could be. But to reiterate part of Randy's point, I think a really important point for everyone to understand is that it's very hard to take away programs that people love. Our community relies upon these programs and these facilities for their social, mental, and physical health. And taking away any of those programs has been very difficult. Andre can tell you as a budget advisory committee member that there's really no fat, there are really no bad programs. And so that has been really the history of how do you patch things together year after year so that you don't do any harm. There have been some great strides, though, I just want to note, in terms of the addressing some of the deferred maintenance. Yes, the number's high. It's a system valued at over 1 billion. And so it's going to have a large deferred maintenance tag on it, even if Parks was doing everything that they possibly could. But the bond measure that the voters approved several years back now made significant investments in the system that Portlanders will enjoy for a very long time. So it really comes down to the number of programs. But I want to make sure that Portlanders also understand that some very good progress has been made as well.
Is there any plan in place for who will lead the charge to ensure that there is a permanent solution by the time this levy expires? Because I guess, you have, city council races, city council turnover, you have bureau director turnover. how is there this assurance that this stopgap measure is really just a one-time thing, and that there's going to be a solid plan for addressing the backlog, ensuring ongoing maintenance, and just making sure that the programs that we want to keep funding are still funded into the future? I mean, what is the structure for ensuring that?
Well, there's the Parks Board, which is having a continuing, discussion along these lines, and obviously the Bureau, in its own, interests, wants to see this, but it does take political leadership, and we hope come January we will have a stable, new Parks Commissioner. We assume whoever gets it will do the best job that they can in terms of taking this discussion forward. And hopefully they won't be solving, a crisis for next year, that they'll actually have, some wind under their wings in order to, begin, thinking about this in a more, detailed way. There has been many ex-Parks employees and many in the community have advocated for a Parks district. And that's a very intriguing thing, but that's also a methodical process that could necessitate having to go to the state legislature to get some rule changes, because districts can only be done at a county level. And so that really doesn't make sense for the Portland Parks system. So we'd have to look at different structures around that. But I think that the separate body of the Parks Parks Board, excuse me, and then whoever our next leader is, that's really going to be the conversation. Anything to add, Kia?
No, I think that's a great response. Thank you.
If I could add anything to that, I think the goal of having people living in close proximity to the parks it will be a big part of whatever plan happens, because it's the people that advocate and engage in the parks that are going to have a real voice. I have a daughter who's been a park counselor every summer for the last 3 years. Through Friends of Noise, we participated in the free lunch program, but by providing arts activities for kids to engage in while they were eating lunch at Stevens Creek Crossing in Southwest Portland. Those are the folks who are going to have to pressure and to engage, not with staff, but with local politicians who are going to have to make these decisions. And if they don't have access to those parks, they're not going to be engaged. So hopefully it just becomes a bit of a, self-sustaining prophecy, where the more opportunities we have to engage with people, the more that they'll be engaged to activate themselves and have a real voice in this process moving forward.
Thank you. Let's see. I know that with the $6.3 million shortfall that there were significant layoffs in the Parks Bureau. But I'm also wondering what other, and also some changes in terms of working with partners to take over ownership or management of some of the facilities. But what other steps has the Bureau taken, or is it taking, to curb growing expenses so that it becomes more manageable with the revenue that's coming in?
Todd, do you feel like you can take that question on?
Sure. Maybe I'll just talk about maybe two things. On the previous conversation about taking a more systemic long-term view, as you're describing, Helen, to make sure that we're balancing both the operating costs and the needs for repair and maintenance, or as we call capital costs. We have a specific program that was launched by Commissioner Fish, what we call Sustainable Future, of which this levy effort is just one part. And so it's taking that holistic view to look at what it's going to take to have sustainable services at Portland Parks and Recreation to balance with the available funding. And so Director Sally, who's on the call, started that process. Director Long is carrying that on now. And so part of it is about having the information available to the public, Parks Board, other oversight bodies, so they can inform these decisions. And then on the managing our operating costs, and I think one of the things Portland Parks does very well is that we've sized our organization to our available resources for our personnel. So we have a relatively small full-time workforce, and we scale up in the spring and the summer and keep them on in the fall, seasonal and casual workforce. So when Randy talked about we have 1,700 unique individuals that are working in the summer, only about 150 of those in the recreation division are full-time employees. The rest are seasonal casual employees. So that's one of the ways that we manage our costs, are to make sure that we have the people available when we have peak use. And then when we have lower use in our winter months, then our costs are lower.
Great, thank you. I think that's pretty much all the questions that I have. Is there anything that we haven't asked about that you wanted to touch on or respond to?
Andre, anything to add? You've been on the VAC for a couple of years now, haven't you?
Yeah, no, it's been a couple of years. Not that you haven't asked it, but I'll admit I'm a relative layperson and new to this process. I did appreciate the opportunity to learn more about some of the nuts and bolts of how parks allocate resources and what things are needed to keep things going. But from my position as a member of the community, I've just been struck at just how valuable Portland Parks have been, not just as a resource, but as a real part of people's families and communities. I mean, I've seen birthday parties, softball games, a variety of activities that aren't necessarily related to athletics, but just related to being that a park is often as much as a resource as someone's home is in Portland. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, where, you know, it took an hour and a half to get to a decent sized park from my apartment. And to think that there are now parks that are designed for kids with disabilities, designed with, you know, multilingual signage, you know, clean bathrooms. Those are things that have a real day-to-day impact on families. And it's great to see that those families now from East Portland are actually being included in that discussion. It's included in that process. While I've never been a member of the East Portland Action Plan, I've seen the role that they've had in advocating for the parks. And I think this is such an important measure, which is why I agreed to participate in this discussion.
Helen, I would add that with the COVID impacts on our economy, and obviously Portland Parks has already seen some of those impacts in terms of their revenue generation, but a lot of individuals and families will not have access to services that they need to maintain their social, their emotional, and their physical health. And expecting City Council to fill the gap, I think, is unrealistic, given that there will be other needs and other city bureaus that are seen by others as being just as dire. So I am very concerned that the park system in the months ahead that we all love and really depend upon, especially the people who don't have access to private clubs, large backyards, and second homes and vacations, that those folks will be impacted the most, and that those services and those amenities will not be there for them. That concerns me deeply. And as a working parent, even thinking about a summer without summer camps, when people need to actually go back to work, I suspect most people will be back in their offices. A lot of folks haven't had the opportunity to stay home and work, but a lot of people will be back in their offices next year sometime. And kids need safe places to be when they're not physically in school. So I'm very concerned about what the COVID impacts on our economy are going to have on families if they don't have access to these services in these facilities. I hope that voters will keep that in mind and will know that they need to support the system that they love and rely upon so much.
Great. Well, thank you all for making,
I just want to leave one other,
Yeah.
feel like I left out that for your consideration.
Sure.
you know, I think it's evident on this call, one of the things, the way we are more efficient as an organization and more effective is the volunteers that Portland Parks and Recreation has. So in fiscal years 2018 and 2019, there was about 446,000 hours of service that Portlanders gave to their city. And that was valued over $5.7 million worth of, you know, contributions through their, you know, picking up leaves in a park or volunteering at a community center or, you know, helping in another summer free for all program. So I just wanted to share that fact with you.
Yeah, and I would only add, Helen, you know, I arrived in 1990, you know, just as the, you know, sort of tax cap wars were happening, you know, Measure 5 and later 47. And, you know, I've watched a lot of, you know, efforts to, you know, fix things and fund things over these years. And I can't think of a vote that is going to have so much impact one way or another and so quickly. Because if this doesn't pass, I mean, you know, our park system is going to be demonstratively changed, you know, by next summer. It will be different and it won't be good. And there's going to be a lot of people in need. This economy is going to be rough, particularly for the lower end for a while. But if we pass it, it's going to make things, you know, better. And it's going to make the system more accessible to those very people who are going to need it most. And so it's a really, really, I think, an important vote for the livability of the city.
Great. Well, thank you all for taking the time to talk with us today about this. I really appreciate it. I think we are all set with our questions, but I will follow up if I have anything more. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for the time. Really appreciate it.